he wasn't a doctor back then, but he was close. He was working on it back then. And I said, would you be a keynote at our conference? And he showed up. And he's always showed up. And so to me, that's like the importance of somebody who always shows up. But today he's going to be speaking about growing past the myth of codependency, a strength-based model for those who love an addict. And this is work that he's been creating. You know, in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of people stretching out beyond the 12-step model, and Rob's always been a pioneer. He's the Chief Clinical Officer of Secret Integrity LLC, clinical programs that provide online education and residential treatment for sex porn and substance sex addicted men and their families. A psychotherapist and addiction specialist, he has created 6 intimacy and addiction treatment programs in the United States, Southeast Asia, and for the U.S. military. And without further ado, I'm going to give him the stage because I'd rather give him the time to share with you than to listen to me and then Marlon who will follow. Because we have, every year I say, oh, I need a little extra space here. And we have such a jam-packed conference. Take bathroom breaks as needed, get food as needed, but hold on to your hats and your seats because we have 2 incredible lineups for you today. This one. Yay.
Thank you, girl. And speaking of support, Renee has supported me throughout my work. So good morning. Thanks to those of you who are here. I appreciate that. I was going to say to you guys, I have been speaking like this for, I don't know, 5 or 10 years longer, and this is the best breakfast I've ever seen. Hey. I mean, I have seen cheap pancakes and crappy waffles. You know that stuff they give you like a Motel 6? That's mostly what I see at conferences. So I find this very impressive, and I wouldn't have had breakfast first had I known. So yeah, real quickly, I have been in the addiction. It's interesting because to do this here because I graduated from this school with my MSW in 1991. And so I went to my UCA, I got my MS, I learned all about tech. I got my MSW here in 1991, and that was a long time ago. And I have been in this field for 32 years, something like that. And in my own recovery, a lot longer than that. That's now more than half my life. And watching it grow, watching it change, watching the acceptance and the understanding, especially in my world, about sex addiction and what we call compulsive sexual behavior disorder. You know, we now have a diagnosis, which is really, really helpful in the ICD-11. We will have one in the DSM. And I've just watched the field grow. In my world, when people would call the media, whatever, they'd say, well, what? We don't believe in this sex addiction. What is this thing really all about? And now I get calls that are like, you know, people are really struggling, and how do we help them? So my world has shifted significantly from having to defend the work I do to being able to truly support people. By the way, I have to do just one little moment of, is this bragging? Keith, you'll have to tell me this bragging. So I went to look through old, you know, I was cleaning out my garage or whatever, and I went to look through old stuff, and I found a Newsweek magazine from 1998 where I commented on Bill Clinton and that little blue dress. And I thought, wow, what were they thinking? And I think he said, yeah, the guy needs treatment, but I'm not really sure. Anyway, one of the things that I've encountered over all these years is this concept of codependency. And in the beginning, you know, in the 80s, I was all over it. You know, let me look at my part, let me look what I did, let me look at my history, let me look, you know, how do I contribute to this, all of that stuff. Never really felt quite right. It took me a long time, I mean, decades, to understand the problem. And I can stand in front of you today and I'll give the talk because people usually throw rocks if I start with this, but I don't believe in it. I think it is a form of victim shaming. I think it is an incredibly mean label applied to people who are doing their loving best to help troubled people. And this is usually when everyone gets silent. It's like, what is this guy talking about? This is the sacred cow. And that's what it is. It's a sacred cow, but that doesn't mean that it's real. So I'm going to talk about this for a while. And I'll just say I have written a clinical book for Rutledge about this. I have written a pop culture book about this. And I've written 11 books on sex addiction.
and compulsive sexuality, and tech and sex and all that stuff. This is the only thing that's going to matter over time. This is the only thing that's going to outlive me, is the concept that we can move beyond a critical label into one that's more affirming. If I have any legacy after 32 years and 11 books, it is to, did I say I had 32 years? Did I say I was in Newsweek? Do you remember Oprah? I almost had hair in my head when I started. But if I can have any enduring legacy for me in my life, and you're like, oh, ego, legacy, sure. But for me, the idea of treating families with more love and respect for what they give to us troubled people, maybe not you, rather than judging them and labeling them and asking them to look at themselves, would be to me a gift that I would like to give to my addiction world. Mental health too, by the way. So why don't I get started? So I'm going to do a little role modeling, you know, tell a few stories, and we'll start with that. So let's do this. I'm going to use a heterosexual model. Doesn't really apply to me, but I'll use it, right? I've been married for 23 years. I've been with my husband for 23 years. Pretty incredible. Okay, so he might have different thoughts about it, but so I have let's say my wife of 15 years has cancer, and she doesn't want to go to treatment. She wants to go off some you know, holistic, no offense, another country, do some kind of holistic nature medicine, whatever it is. And so she didn't want to go to treatment. And we have 3 kids under the age of 14. And in response to that, I push aside my own needs and desires. I work 2 jobs. I stop all my self-care and recreation. I gain weight. I lose sleep. I worry all the time. I'm sick. I'm overwhelmed. I'm irritable. I'm vigilant. And I'm afraid, what is cancer going to do to my children, my family? I'm overwhelmed, I'm not sleeping. It's all I can think about. I've gotten every book on cancer I can find and read it. How do you think my friends and my family and my therapist might support me in this set of circumstances? Do you think they would understand that I've been victimized? Our whole family has been victimized by the disease of cancer, which we never expected would happen when we were saying we're getting married or having kids, but here we are. We are a family dealing with that kind of crisis. And my experience of people like this is we call them angels. What an angel you are to give up everything in your life to take care of this person, and how loving and wonderful you are to work 24/7 to try to make your family get through such difficult circumstances. Now let's try a different scenario. My wife of 15 years is addicted to opioids, and she's resistant to treatment. We have 3 kids under the age of 14. And in response to this crisis, I push aside my own needs and desires. I work 2 jobs, and I stop self-care and recreation. I gain weight, I lose sleep, and I worry all the time. What's going to happen to our family? I'm sick, I'm overwhelmed, I'm irritable, I'm vigilant, and I'm afraid. It's all I can think about, morning, noon, and night. Where's the bottle of pills? How do I, all that stuff. How do you think my friends and family and therapists would advise me in this set of circumstances? Do you think that they would see me as a victim of the disease of addiction? That, and we certainly know it's a brain disorder, it's an addiction, it's a disease, right? Do you think that we have been compromised, something we never really expected when we were getting married? We didn't think this was going to happen, but here we are in the middle of a crisis in our family. So my question is, you know, what's the difference? And the issue for me is that over 35 years, we've seen many, many new forms of treatment for addicts. We do EMDR, we do trauma work, we do experiential, somatic, equine. I think Promise we used to have wolf therapy, if I recall. I look at the addiction field and I think what a great job we've done to reach out to these people and try to find different ways, whatever works for them, of finding a way to healing and sobriety. But when it comes to the overarching acknowledged treatment models for family, for loved ones, and for spouses, we have one in 40-something years. And that one is codependency. We have no new, fully articulated models for the treatment of spouses and families of the loved ones of addicts, and I would say the loved ones of mentally ill. Although that world has caught up a little bit, I think. So let's talk about how this happened. Here are the big 4. These 4 books defined and dominated the field and created the concept of codependency in the 1980s. I remember I was there. And they laid out, I was, and and they laid out, and I was involved with a troubled person, and they laid out, let me see here, there we go, the underlying concepts of codependency, which remain unchanged since publication, because you can't just go in and say, oh, I don't like that form of codependency, I'm going to practice this. Once you have a formally laid out model of treatment, that is the formally laid out model of treatment. You can adapt it, you can look at it differently, but you still call it what you call it. And so, Claudia Black's It Will Never Happen to Me in 1982, Women Who Love Too Much, think of the title, in 1985, Codependent No More in 1986, and a book called Codependence, Treating and Diagnosis and Treatment by a guy by the name of Tim Cermak. And the reason I put that up is because he was absolutely dedicated to getting the DSM. We are going to have a DSM diagnosis for codependency, and he fought, and he fought, and he fought, and it never happened. There's lots of reasons for that. Like there's no research to support codependency. There's no criteria for a diagnosis. I have a friend who was involved with some of these folks who I love and know, by the way. There's no blame, no shame. They set the field. They created, to some degree, the whole idea after Al-Anon of how to look at these folks. But all the things they wrote came out of their own personal experience. Claudia and Pia and all these people wrote about what they went through, their husbands, their abusive families and husbands, or dads, how it played out in their own lives. But this concept was not research-based. This concept was not, did not evolve out of places like this. What it is, and always was, is a pop culture concept that bled and became a psychological concept. We adopted it from pop culture. We didn't create it and pass it to pop culture, and I think that is something to really think about. So, this was the way we looked at this work. This was the information we had. Everyone embraced this. A lot of treatment centers made a lot of money having codependency programs. Lots and lots and lots. And I think in some ways we encouraged the field without understanding it, because there were a lot of troubled people who were hurting, and they were going to run to get help because the problem was them. And if they just looked at themselves, the family would get better. So, Codependent No More sold 11 million copies. It was translated into 15 languages. Women bought 95% of these books because women buy 95% of all self-help books. I know this because I've written 11 of them. And they continue to do so today. Which, by the way, as a self-help author, makes it very difficult for me to sell books, because I write about men, for the most part. And so the only way I can get a book to a man is if I give it to a female spouse or friend, and she reads it and she throws it at him. It's like, you read that, and that is actually how I sell books to men. That, or they're so desperate to heal their relationships, they'll actually read a self-help book. Sorry guys, but I look at the numbers. As of 1990, there were 102 books, 1990. So that's 86 was Codependent No More, I think it was. By 1990, there were 102 books with some form of the word codependency in the title. As of 2018, when I finished my PhD, there were 340 books with some form of the word codependency in the title. Well, let me just say this. Which is the right one? Which of the 340 books, or however many there are, is the right one? Is it the one that was written in 1986 in Arizona? Is it the one that was written in the 1990s? Is it because we have no validated criteria, we have no research on the topic. So how do we know which is which? So 94 was the last time any validated research was done. Some of you weren't born. Codependency has never been the DSM, ever. It was never in the ICD-11, which is the International Code of, I never get that right, International Code of Disorders, of, that thing, which the World Health Organization created. Now, we always had pathological dependency in the DSM, and I think that is what we really look at as disease. Disease is when someone cannot function. They are not able to carry out the duties of their daily lives. They cannot function, depression, anxiety. But codependents mostly can work and live their lives, and they may have personal problems, and they may have relationship problems, or whatever, but they don't rise to the level of a diagnosis. We have a diagnosis. Dependent personality means that you cannot function without that other person. You can't work, you don't feed yourself, you can't get out of bed, you don't function unless you have that other person, and you are entirely dependent upon them. So we already had diagnosis for pathological dependency. Part of the pushback was, why do we need another one? It was like, it was like pathological dependency light, Oh, I was going to say something about that. Let me go back for a second. So I remember, because I was around the 80s, that everybody was codependent. If I went out of my way to take a friend across town in LA traffic, oh my God, you're such a cow. You know, you went out of your way to take this person. Don't you realize they could take a bus? And anyone who gave too much was considered codependent. By who? By therapists, by the DSM. No, we were considered codependent by friends. Look, you got to read this book. You got to look how troubled you are because you gave so much to someone you care about, and you should be giving more to yourself. We were living in a period, many of you don't remember, of individualism. The Me Too generation, I'm sorry, the Me First generation of the boomers was completely focused on themselves. And this whole model of, I need to individuate, I need to grow, I need to be a better person, and then I will be able to do, have better family life and better community life, was great for that period, est, lifespan, insight, all that stuff that was going on, personal development, but it was about me. It wasn't about us. So this is part of my issue with it, is this whole model is not about me moving toward community. It's me figuring it out for myself. And I think that's problematic. So by the way, here are titles number 338, 339, 340, and 341. And I would ask you, what has not been said in 40 years about this topic? So we have codependency, loves me not. We have codependency for dummies. We have the end of codependency. We have conquering codependency. And we have codependency, I can't even read that. What is it? The recovery guide. Now this is when I did my dissertation on the topic of codependency. So believe me, I have read a lot more than I ever wanted to read about this topic. If you understand a diagnosis and an issue and how it works, why do you need 340 books that are self-help oriented? Because none of these were written by scientists. These were written by people who said, oh, well, I know how to work with codependency. We had no research since 1994. It's never been validated as a diagnosis. We don't have any clinical criteria. Can I know your name? You mind? Oh, I'm just going to play with you. Yeah, you. Marlene. So Marlene lives in New York. And I run a treatment center in California, and she sent me a client, and she said, you know, this client is just so codependent. And I say, oh yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I can see that. What is she talking about? Is she talking about book number 227, or did she read it in the 80s, or because we have no clinical criteria? So this is the whole point. You like the DSM, you like the labels, you don't. But when she says someone's, thank you, Marlene, when she says someone's depressed, and I go to the DSM and it says, here are the criteria for depression, I know that we're talking about the same thing. But if we don't have a formal diagnosis, what are we talking about? Because she studied codependency in the 90s. And I studied codependency in 2011. What are we talking about? How do we compare our treatment of this client if we don't fully understand what we're talking about, even though we have an idea of something? So, what's the problem with codependency? Well, in my mind, it confuses loved ones who've been hyper-functional the whole time. They not only do for their families, they do extra for their families, and then more for their families. They fill in every space that is empty in that family in order to make it continue to function. It diminishes their grief and their pain because we're asked them to look at ourselves rather than consider the situation that they're in. It co-opts remorse. And the one thing I think Kubler-Ross missed in the discussion of grief was remorse. Because everybody who has a dog died or a father died or whatever it is said, gosh, I wish I'd said that. Or why didn't I do this? Why didn't I walk my dog more? Why didn't I spend more time with my dad? Remorse is inherent in our experience of grief. So when I am grieving the loss of my healthy family, everybody says, if we just done this, if we just said that, if we just, how we could have had, she wouldn't have used if we just, well, what does codependency say? You're right. You could have done a better job. You could have done, it co-opts remorse and makes people feel that they themselves are part of the problem. It doesn't promote emotional regulation. If our goal with family members when they're out of control is to stabilize them and help me in a better place, it's not stabilizing those of you who do the work to explore your history, to look at trauma. This is not stabilizing. By the way, you know what stabilizing is? Let me help you get through the day. How are you going to get through tonight when you get your kids home and there's alcohol in the house? How are you going to do if she or he starts yelling? That's stabilizing. I will be there for you. I can support you. Let me look at what your grandmother did when you were 7 is not particularly stabilizing because it's anxiety producing. It's framed, codependency frames loving, supportive people as enabling and difficult, whose unresolved personal problems are contributing to addiction. It's gender biased. because it speaks to women as being enabling and enmeshed and not self-focused and giving too much and all of those qualities. In other words, at the time, and it worked perfectly for feminism at the time, a woman needs to be more like a man. More aggressive, more assertive, more self-focused. And that's great if you want to break through the glass ceiling in the workplace, and it was. But not so much in interpersonal relationships. It's not about competition, it's not about achievement, it's not about, about being the best person I can be, so that it's interrelational. And that's not what this was focused on. It is culturally biased. I have been to Native American populations where I've given this talk. I have been to African American populations where I've given this talk in churches. And they come to me and say, thank God, somebody understands my culture. That we don't move outside of our culture when we're in crisis, we move toward it. We don't tell people to individuate and become stronger people. We ask them to turn toward us and say, I'm vulnerable, can you help me? And communities come together. And I have heard, in fact, there's a great comment from a Latina social worker who said something like, the concept of codependency in my culture would be considered selfish. Why would I focus on me when there's a crisis in the community? So I think there's a lot of bias, a lot of Eurocentric bias. Pull yourself out of the bootstraps, be a strong person, you don't need to depend on anyone, you can fix yourself. What's wrong with you that you're looking for so much help, or you're giving so much of yourself as a woman? Both gender biased and culturally biased, which doesn't fly for me as a diagnosis. Addicts, by the way, love the diagnosis. Love it. Because it's great. I can say, well, if she wasn't codependent, why wouldn't I be drinking? Or I would just stop using if she would just stop nagging me. Or if he would just, we have given addicts a perfect opportunity to use their entitlement to externalize the problem and blame someone else. See, you were right all along. He is the problem. If you just weren't married to this enabling and mesh about you, maybe you would do better in your recovery. I see it as a more sophisticated form of victim shaming. I don't think I have this quote in here, but there's a guy by the name of William White, who is the historian of the addiction field. And he talked about how female partners with wives were talked about in the 1950s who were partners of addicts. And basically what it said was, if you were married to one of these women, if I was married to one of these women, I would use too. It spoke to them, their dysfunction and their dysregulation as being intolerable, and that they were deeply troubled because of this. I don't think what we do with codependency is very different. We turn to them and say, and we do this. And you're the victim of this. You're the one whose spouse lost their job. You're the one who has to take care of your kids. You're the one who has to work 2 jobs. You have been victimized by this disease, and you've got to step up and give up yourself to make it work. And then you're telling me, no, you're not the victim of these circumstances, you're in part of the cause. And to me, that is shaming the victim. It is an anti-dependent message. We don't live in that world anymore. There's no room in the concept of codependency for attachment, for the deep and enduring belief that I will do anything for you because you're part of my family and I don't care what it costs me. If your child, your friend, your loved one was running across the street and that bus was coming, you, in a moment of intensity, would run across the street and get hit by the bus before you'd let your kids get hit by the bus. Well, that's really codependent. I mean, you know, they're going to get hit by the bus, they're not going to hit, but you shouldn't put yourself at risk. Ultimately, the sacrifice we make for the people we love is not a disorder, it's a strength. Do we do it right? No. Am I the best person to be able to help my troubled loved one learn how to heal and be a better family member? Probably not. I'm going to do it wrong. I'm going to do it in ways that look troubled. I'm going to do it in unhelpful ways. But that's the best I can do. And to turn around to me and say, look at these things you're doing and how they're contributing to the problem, I'm just trying to make the problem better. Because I want my family to work and I love them. It is anti-dependent to pull people apart and say, let's look at your part and your part. This is where system theory kind of failed the family, I think. And as much as Sean Bradshaw loved the man, knew the man, spent some time with the man, I don't think the idea that everyone takes a role because they are playing this out, because on and on and on, I just don't think it works that way. So, here's Melody Beatty, 1986. Think about attachment. She said, stop centering and focusing on other people. Settle down and in ourselves. She was talking to women. Stop seeking so much approval and validation from others. That was the men. We don't need the approval of everyone and anyone. We only need our own approval. This is my highlight. But she said, relationships help, but they cannot be our source. Well, I gotta tell you, my relationship is my source. My home is the foundation of my life, and it is a brutal world out there. And when I come home, my relationship, wherever we are in the world, whether we have money or we don't, or this is what makes me feel safe and renews me. In my children, my family, my loved ones are the source of my life. And that is a pro-dependent, a positive dependency message. This was not a message for men in the 1980s. It was a siren song for women. Women who were preaching, and needed to achieve independence from men. Codependency does not promote interdependence. It is inherently anti-dependent. So based on that, what do we do with codependent clients? Treatment for loved ones of addicts, and I would say also in part the mentally ill, who are codependent by definition, requires them to understand their trauma history and directly understand how it relates to why they chose this person to love and why they stayed with this person. It asks them to understand and look at the unproductive ways in which their trauma history is playing out into their current relationship and thus inadvertently helping to drive that dysfunction or keep it in crisis. Codependent people have to acknowledge the ways in which they are acting out in their own unresolved issues, thereby making the addiction of the problem worse because they're enabling and meshing and raging and threatening and nagging and all those characteristics that we assign to these troubled people. They most of all have to acknowledge and act on the idea that their own unmet childhood needs are playing out into this problematic relationship. Thus, they need to detach, they need to set boundaries, they need to focus on themselves, and they need to establish clear boundaries from the person they're involved with. I think that's a problem on a whole bunch of levels. Most of all, I think it's a problem because of what we say about them. I love someone and I'm destroying my own life trying to help them in any way I can, but I'm enabling, I'm enmeshed, I'm raging, I'm threatening, I'm nagging. What would you do if the people you care about were falling apart and you could... You know what, my husband was very ill a couple of years ago, and the hardest thing in the world for me was that I couldn't help him. I could change the sheets, I could buy food, I could sit by his bedside, but I couldn't make it better. And that was I don't know what the word is, but that was one of the worst feelings I can experience. What's it like to watch an addict loved one fall apart, who's a contributing important member of your family, or someone who becomes mentally ill? Wouldn't I become desperate? Wouldn't I fall apart? Wouldn't I want to pray and look and do anything to try and make it better, because there's nothing more painful than watching a loved one fade away in front of you and there's nothing you can do for them. So this is codependence gone awry. The codependence movement's progenitors, and now we're talking about Claudia and Pia and all those amazing women, and they are. The codependence movement's progenitors were almost certainly not trying to say that loved ones of addicts provide care based solely on their personal insecurities and neuroses, but that's where we are. Like under other misunderstood and misused psychological expressions, codependency has taken on a life of its own. Since its introduction in the 1980s, its meaning has devolved to describe a weak, needy, clingy, and even emotionally sick person. Now, what I hear from many of you, either in private practice or in this treatment world, is, well, I don't do codependency treatment that more. I mean, we do it differently. And I would say, well, what model do you work under? What research is there to back up that criteria? How do you define what you do and explain to other people when they're doing something different? Because a rose by a rose, well, you know what that is, it's still a rose. Revisions or adaptations to previously formalized treatment models cannot eliminate their original intent. If you're going to change original intent, you have to change the model or call it something else. As in the case of all founding codependency literature, it places trauma repetition at the core of a loved one's response to addiction or mental illness. The work, regardless of how it's softened or changed, is still codependency, because that is the definition. Now, I love you guys, but I spent 30 years in and around treatment centers, from cleaning up people's shit and lighting their cigarettes and cutting their hair all the way to today. And I have seen you lovely people say things like, well, those spouses just don't want to own up to their part. Or you know, that that partner views their addict as the sole source of the problem, and it makes it hard to help them. They don't see how their attempts to be caregivers are making things worse. Those parents may be sober, but they're every bit as sick as their children, and sometimes sicker. They just can't stop rescuing, even though it causes more problems than it solves. I heard this in lunchrooms, I heard this in nurses' stations, I heard very loving, compassionate, kind, committed therapists devalue, dismiss, and apply labels because they didn't feel comfortable with this population, or they didn't like it was described as pathology. So who would run or turn to more of that kind of treatment? You already are in a crisis in your own life. So here's what I suggest to you. What if the loved ones of addicts and the mentally ill aren't so difficult to treat at all? What if the problem has lain more in how we have conceptualized them? What if our primary and sole model for treating spouses and loved ones has misunderstood and marginalized them by leaving them feeling unnecessarily blamed and shamed? Why do we prejudge loved ones of addicts as codependent and therefore as drivers of a dysfunctional family? Do you know how many therapists, if I call them, sorry, and I say, I got Mary Jones and her husband's an addict and he's in the hospital, I want you to help her out. How many of them already think, well, she must be codependent? How and where do we ever judge or label or pathologize or diagnose someone we've never met? And yet and by the way, who was that person 2 months ago or 2 years ago before the addict was active and their life was working? We're seeing someone in the moment of their greatest crisis in their life. And by the way, I was taught in school right over there, you never diagnose someone in a crisis. You give them a long period of time to get to know them, but they are codependent by definition, right away. What if that diagnosis, unquote, and treatment pushes them into feeling misunderstood and defensive? Why not focus on their strengths from day one and be where they are? And I was told to follow clients. I was told to follow you, not to make up my own concept and try to fit you into it, which is, I think, what's happening in codependency. So if our goal is to improve self-regulation in people in a crisis and return them to prior levels of stability and coping, then codependency is counterproductive, because it doesn't calm them down, it doesn't give them the way through, get through the day, it doesn't say I'll be there for you no matter what. It says we got to take out a book and we got to look at this model and you got to do this worksheet and see where you fit in. So I created another model and I named it. By the way, part of the problem that, part of the problem with codependency is it was not copyrighted. Melody Beatty didn't do that, and so anybody who wanted to write a book about codependency could write a book about codependency, because that label, that idea was she never owned it. And unfortunately, in the world we live in, you gotta own something, because otherwise everybody can use it and has access to it. So whatever the original intent was, has moved into what everybody thinks it is over 40 years. So I was interested in Stan Tapkin. He was here as a very good friend of mine, and we've done some writing together, some work together, and I have a podcast with him, and he's endorsed my books, and he is sort of, in my world, one of the gurus of attachment. And he and I sat down and I said, look, I've got a new word for this, I want to know what you think. I needed a strength-based and attachment-focused word for someone who's struggling with a partnership or involvement with an addict. And I came up with and ran by him, and he agreed, this idea of prodependence. Prodependence. That when the spouse or loved one of an active addict walks into my office, I see them as someone in a profound life crisis that is not of their own making, and one that anyone would have little ability to solve on their own. By definition, they have been victimized and betrayed by the addict's behavior, lying, cheating, manipulating. This is someone they enjoyed a deep, trusting bond with. Now, why would I expect this family member to act like a therapist? How would I expect them to do the right things? They've never studied addiction or treatment. It seems to me that they are just doing their best to survive and maintain stability in an out-of-control situation. Do I want to tell that story? Oh yeah, if I have time. So I'll tell you my favorite harm reduction story, because this drives people crazy. And I'll go really fast. By the way, I like to get every word out and get through every slide, and a friend of mine said, well, you just end up talking faster. Which I go, oh, that's probably true, right? This is true. I worked with a woman who didn't have a lot of resources, didn't have a lot of financial, had a number of kids. Her husband was drinking during the day. He'd lost several jobs, he'd gotten several DUIs, and he'd been driving drunk with her kids in the car. So one day he came home and there was an ice cold bottle of vodka on the dining table. And she said, you know what? If you come home by 4 o'clock and you're sober, you can have as much of that as you want. Can you imagine what we would say about her? Enabling, enmeshing, feeding the addiction. Well, you know what? That woman got 2 years of her husband being sober during the day. He didn't lose a job. He didn't get arrested for DUI. And he didn't take those kids back and forth to school when he was drinking. Now, after that 2 years, he wasn't able to maintain it. He started drinking their day. But I call it harm reduction. She was able to get that man to be able to function well enough for her to get through the next 2 years. She might have thought it would go on forever, but it didn't. So, what I think someone like, so I love that story, right? Great story. Because that's when people go, this guy's crazy, I'm out of the room. So what I think, and I've done a lot of research about this, is that what family members need when they're in these situations, especially a spouse, is crisis intervention treatment. They're in a crisis right then and there. And crisis intervention treatment, which I go through, is much more of a response to what they are going through in the moment, what they're experiencing. Oh, and by the way, when codependency treatment was really, really a deal, I had 30 individual therapy sessions on my insurance. And I didn't work all night long on the computer and all day long at work and 24/7, and the world was not like it is today. I don't think a lot of people have time to read 5 books and self-examine and go to their therapist. In fact, most people never go to therapy. You know, people who come to see us are privileged. I give away everything I can, books, podcasts, as much as I can, because I know that 95% of the population will never make it to therapy, ever, not to mention a treatment center. They don't have those resources. So to say to them, read a lot of books, go to self-reflective support groups, go look at your own issues, and make sure you go to a lot of therapy, is they're never going to do those things. But 30 years ago, that was much more accessible and available to many people than it is now. I get 4 therapy sessions on my insurance. What that means is that you're going to teach me how to get through the circumstances I'm in if I'm lucky. So people in the midst of a profound life crisis, they need crisis counseling. Not analysis, not exploration, not evaluation of how they'd intervene, because those experiences for them feel blaming, intrusive, painful, counterintuitive, and distracting. Well, then I hear from my therapist friends, who are usually younger, I have to say, but all my therapist friends are younger now. I used to be the youngest person in the room, and now I'm the oldest person in the room. And I don't know how that happened. Because emotionally, I'm still the youngest person in the room, just me. So I hear this from my younger friends, trauma, trauma, trauma. What about their trauma? They have lots of trauma. Wait. If later they want to examine at some point, once the crisis has passed, their own history, then they will come to us and say, you know, some things happened when she was drinking and I want to understand my part. It is not our job to force self-examination or self-exploration on anybody. They didn't come to us for that. They came trying to figure out how to deal with the addiction, how to, deal with what do I do, and all of that kind of stuff. What I say to you therapists who respond to everything you see in the moment is one of the best things I learned in therapy school, which was bring out a pad, whatever kind of pad you use, and write it down. That doesn't mean you have to say it. It may be amazing. Oh, I see this, all these connections. Keep your mouth shut. Because they are not in a place to deal with it and talk about. Choose when and what you're going to say. Now, some of you say, well, I don't do codependency treatment like that anymore. I do it in all kinds of other ways. And as I said, you cannot adapt a previously evolved model and call it something else unless you have a new model. So then I looked at crisis counseling. And basically, I sifted through all as much crisis literature information as I could in my PhD dissertation. And I just want you to know the words I write here are not mine. They are a compilation of every single piece I could find into one narrow, funnel. So just know, I didn't write this, I copied it, basically, and I attributed it, just so I don't lose my PhD. The general consensus is that crisis is a state of emotional turmoil or an acute emotional reaction to a powerful stimulus or demand. There are 3 characteristics of a crisis. Think about partners and family members of people who are actively using or acting out, or depressed and running around not able to function. The usual balance between thinking and emotions is disturbed. The usual coping mechanisms fail. There is evidence of impairment in them or their family. Crisis intervention methods are meant to provide help to individuals or groups during a period of extreme stress. This intervention is by design temporary, active, and supportive. So, crisis intervention should, and I do want you to think of codependency, and again, know that I didn't write this, there are certain techniques that we want to follow. One, simplicity. People respond best to simple procedures. Simple things have the best chance of achieving a positive effect when someone's in crisis. Brevity. No weekends, no intensives, no weeks. Psychological first aid needs to remain short, from a few minutes to an hour. Be concrete. Give them direction. Go to the support group. Read this book. Come call me. This, that. This is what you do in the evening if she's throwing things, or they need concrete direction about the experiences that they're in. Be pragmatic and validate. Impractical suggestions cause the person to feel more frustrated. Work in the here and now. Clients in a crisis do not have the psychological sophistication to engage in in-depth clinical evaluations or discussions of the past. Remain focused on the problems at hand. Offer hope. Set up expectations of a reasonable, positive outcome. Normalize their experience. I've helped lots of people. Things can get better. I see addiction. You're not the only one. Give them hope. So, in the work that I do, in my belief system, which is codependent, I say that we need to avoid, with families and loved ones of addicts, we need to avoid exploring their role in the addiction and the family problems. We need to avoid extensive assessments of their childhood and their family history, because that immediately says to someone, oh, you're looking at me, I must be part of the problem. We need to avoid deep and meaningful assessments of the couple and family and spouses beyond the problem we're dealing with. We should avoid pathologizing or labeling. We should avoid diagnosing, period. Anyone is codependent, bipolar, borderline, or any other way of explaining their extreme distress. They are in crisis. People act in all kinds of crazy ways. And by the way, my trauma issues, because we regress when we're in a crisis. You have a baby who is, completely diaper trained, and then grandma dies and they start wetting their bed again. Human beings regress under crisis. Maybe all the trauma acting out that you see in me is because I am in a regress situation and all that stuff has come up for me. Does that mean it's the time to explore it and look at it? No. Because pulling it out makes my chore and my job in the moment harder. We cannot accurately diagnose people in a crisis, focus on here and now, actively help them. Now this is my favorite slide, I have to say. Why, I should have separated this. If there is no codependency, why do spouses and family members and loved ones give up their lives to fix and rescue an addict? If it's not my pathology, why do I do it? And there's only one answer. Because they love them. I would give anything to help you if I love you, and I would act like a crazy person, and I would do things that were completely out of control and wouldn't make any sense to you, and look like deep pathology. But I'm doing the best I can when I am deeply attached to someone, and they are the source of my stability and home. I'd pretty much do anything to make them better, no matter what it cost me in my life. I would gain weight. I would read every book. I know partners of addicts, they read every single book that's ever been created on addiction. Why wouldn't they? Because your loved one had cancer, you would read every single book on cancer and everything you'd find. Why is this any different? So I am interested in the work I've done to reframe these behaviors as strengths. And I like this slide because you guys like this slide. How much time do I have? About 15 minutes? Yeah. Okay, oh my God, I'm going to run out of things to say. So, what I've been interested in doing, and what I'm going to talk slower now, what I've done is, in my work, is to reframe all of these unpleasant, devaluing, challenging labels and making them positive in the framework of I'm doing everything I can to love you and make you get better. So when I talk about someone being enmeshed, instead of that I say they're deeply involved. Instead of saying they're externally focused, which they are, I say why they're just focusing on the problem that's in front of them. Instead of saying they're enabling, I say they're trying their best to be supportive. Instead of saying they're fearful, I would say they're deeply concerned. Instead of saying they lack healthy boundaries, I would say they are eager to do whatever they can to take care of a loved one, even if it hurts them. When we say about the codependent, they just can't stop fixing, I would say they'll do whatever they can to try to make the problem better. These are compassionate, empathic responses to someone who has given up their life and shown all this crazy dysfunction because they're doing the best they can to help this person. And we jump on the bandwagon and we label their best attempts to help and support with nasty names and devaluing. How many of us have said, oh, well, she's just so enabling. You know, oh my God, they're so enmeshed, I can't believe. Well, maybe she's moved closer to him because she's trying to help him function. Maybe she's enabling, putting that bottle on the table because that's the best she could do. You know, it really bothers me. Of course, lots of things bother me. I don't like drama, but I've been there. It really bothers me when we expect these people to do the right thing. There is very few partners that I know or family members who went to graduate school in the study of addiction. Some of them never went to college. And yet somehow I think, well, why aren't they acting this way? Don't they know that's a problem? They should be doing it like this. How would they know that? Why would they know that? Why would they automatically know how we think they would be better served by helping this family member when they've never studied the things we've studied? They're doing what is intuitive to them to try to help the person they love. And by the way, most of these things would work if the person wasn't so troubled that they were unable to help. And by the way, we all try to do everything we can. We don't want to reach out to other people. We don't want to talk about them being addicted. We want to fix it. You know, we still live in that period where on the outside everything's great. By the way, I know that the word Facebook no longer has any meaning in the culture. I get that. But if you look on Instagram or TikTok or Facebook and you look at people talking about their families, it's the 1950s. You know, well, everything's great and our kids just graduated from school and look at us at Christmas time and here's my kid, you know, just getting ready to get married and we have so much love in the family. And that's how it looked in the 50s, which was everything was, I wasn't there by the way, everything was good on the outside and nobody talked about what's going on the inside. This is how all of us feel. We don't want to show our bad cards to other people. We hide them. And so when you're going through something like this, which would label and devalue the person that you love, you would do your best to hide it and avoid it and try to fix it yourself. You don't want the neighbors to know. I will say though that being alcoholic, especially in LA, is kind of groovy. You know, has been for a while. You know, and especially, and this is so unique, I think, to hear, which is, who's your therapist? Where do you go? What group are you in? What 12-step meeting is like, it's a badge of honor. Like, well, I see Mary Jones. Did you know she has a waiting list? Well, she charges $300 an hour. I actually had a client, I have to say this. I told him what we charge because I don't believe, no matter how much experience I have in charging inordinate fees, I'm not a lawyer. You know, I'm not worth $450 an hour. If I don't believe in it, I don't think that's what I'm here to do. Why did I say that? See, this is what happens when you're 60. I have no idea why I say that.
Thank you for saying that.
Badge of honor. Yes, I have. Yeah, all that. So, I'm going to ask you to say that, because I heard like 12 people. Someone over here said it.
You're going to tell us a story about a client calling you about students about your fee.
Oh, right. Thank you. So I appreciate that. And by the way, if you tell them where my keys are, really, even though they have a tag on it, but I forgot my phone. So I can't say where are my keys. But anyway, absolutely, this is absolutely true. I had a man call me. We have a treatment center here in LA for men who sexually act out and men who have struggled with sexual acting out and co-occurring drug abuse. That's what we do. And we are not spectacularly expensive because that's not what I think treatment should be. And we don't take insurance because I think it's unethical. And I don't want to play that game. I don't want to lie. I don't want to beg. I don't want to argue with doctors on how many more sessions they need. I don't want underpayment. I think it's a cheat. It's a bad business. And so I avoid it like the plague. But anyway, I had a client call and say, what do you charge per day at your treatment center? And I said this to him, and he said, you know, so-and-so's charging a lot more. It's probably a better place. That's LA, in my experience. I don't charge enough, therefore I'm not good enough at what I do. Just saying. So let's go through these. I'm almost done. You're living in denial. Well, how about I'm unwilling to give up on someone I love. They're angry all the time. Well, how about their life has been out of control forever, and they're furious about not being able to control things that they need to control, like their family life. They're controlling and nagging. How about they will do anything they can to affect change? They will yell, they will scream, they will throw things, they will leave, they will keep people in there. They will do all this crazy stuff because they're trying to make things better. Why can we not take crazy behavior and see it from the perspective of a strength? To me, someone who is deeply involved, focused on the problem, supportive, concerned, eager to care for that person, does whatever they can to help, is unwilling to give up, determined to protect the family, fearful of out-of-control losses, trying to affect change, and anticipating the problems are coming so they can get ahead of it. Those are strengths. The ability to hold on to someone and do everything you can for someone who is troubled and deeply struggling that you love is a strength. You're an angel. Who would give up their life to help somebody else, especially if they could just stop it and get better? You know, if she would just take her cancer medication, if he would just go to treatment. For some reason, addiction and addiction partners and families get labeled just like the addicts do. We put addiction in this box of all the things we call it, and then the family members get dragged in by association. So, I love this because I said it. I hear this a lot from therapists and have over the decades. You know, if we don't do therapy with them, if they don't work through their codependency, they're just going to pick someone else just like this. They're going to do trauma repetition. They're going to recreate, and maybe that person isn't drinking, but then later they find out they're gambling, but they end up in the same dynamic unless we help them grow. And I say you're absolutely right. That is true. Because 2s don't marry 7s. We marry and engage with people who are at the same level of our psychological and often physical circumstances. So if I'm a 2 emotionally, I live a crazy life. I'm full of drama. Everything's a mess. I need people to come to me and rescue me all the time. I'm doing whatever I do to look like a crazy person. But I'm looking for someone who's soft and gentle and clear and has their shit together. And I look over at that 7, so true of the women I work with, sorry, the men too, but a lot of the women. I look over that, and don't go after me for that later, please. And I look over, and she wants to go out with that 7, who's got it together and is reasonably stable, and you know he or she has got a good job, and she says, oh, and what does she say about the 7? Inevitably. He's boring. He's not that interesting. He's not that exciting. You know, I should pick guys who are like that, but whatever it is. So they're never going to marry as the, you know, get a relationship, whatever. As a 2, I'm never going to get involved with a 7 because they have it together too much, and I'm always going to feel inadequate, and there's not going to be anything for me to hook onto psychologically because they don't share some of the pathology that I do. At the other end, I'm a 7. My life's pretty together. I'm doing really well. I'm looking to date and have a relationship. You know how that 2 looks to me? Crazy. Yeah. Drama, crazy, don't want anything to do with them. My friend said, leave him or her alone. 2s are never going to marry 7s. So if I'm a 4 and I marry a 3, or you're a 5 and I marry a 4, maybe together we can become a 7. Maybe together with our own shared issues, we can both grow in reflection, in commitment to change, if we are in that place. So it is never going to be the case, in my belief, that if you really grow someone's emotional, blah, 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 that they're then going to marry. Maybe they're going to get involved with somebody who is a little bit, maybe they'll get involved with a 3 when they're a 2. But basically, we're going to, and in case any of you are in long-term relationships, you might consider who you married and where they're at and who they are. And my partner is perfect for me. You know why he's perfect for me and why I've been married 23 years in part? Because he will never leave me, ever. He will never, ever leave me. That is part of who he is. And my profound abandonment issues, because my mother was mentally ill and in and out of hospitals my whole life, they're profound. When I love someone, they're going to leave. When I love someone, I'm going to end up taking care of them. When I love somebody, they're going to fall apart. That is my deepest attachment, early life experiences. And they don't go away because of trauma work, by the way. I hate it when people say we're going to resolve their trauma. We're going to help them work through their trauma. We're going to fix their trauma. We don't heal it. We teach people to adapt to it, to live with it, to learn to tolerate it, to not be reactive to it. It's not like the scar goes away because I put a Band-Aid on it, it's still a scar. And the scars in my brain related, and they are, neurological scars in my brain that have to do to my adaptation to unhealthy attachment are always going to be there. But my nice big cognitive brain can teach me, oh, don't do it that way, or oh, I've learned that this is a better situation. Or for me as narcissistic, when I see her face looking like, why did you say that? Probably I didn't say it right. I've learned it from the outside in because I'm never going to have it from the inside out. Sorry, therapists. We can't fix things that were broken when we were 5. You just can't fix them. You can teach people to adapt to them. So yes, people are going to, no matter how much therapy they have, find someone who's in a reasonably similar situation as they are. And my husband will never leave me, and my greatest fear is abandonment. And you know what? I am consistently nurturing and supportive, and in many ways put him first. And he never had a birthday party. Never ever gave him a gift. So what a great pair we are. I'll just tell you this, and then I'm going to stop. The first time I went to therapy, and I went to the Gay and Lesbian Center, it wasn't therapy, it was a volunteer. And this was in the 80s, late 80s, something like that. I was born in 61, so I was like 24, 25 at the time. And I said to this therapist, all I want to do is have a relationship. I want a relationship, you know, because I want a relationship, because I didn't have one, I didn't want to be abandoned, I was alone, you know, all of that. And plus, I like relationships. So in any way, case, he said to me, well, what do you think a relationship is? And I said, well, I'm half a pie, and they're half a pie, and together we're a pie. And he said, oh, no. You're a pie, and they're a pie, and together you're 2 pies. I spent 20 years thinking he was right. He was wrong. He was completely wrong. My strengths are perfectly met to the vulnerabilities of my partner, and his strengths are perfectly met to my vulnerabilities, and together, this is attachment, folks, this is mutual interdependency, together we are able to create a stronger unit than we were separately. That, I think, is why 2s don't marry 7s, and that is why, it's not why my husband and I are together, but it's part of the glue that holds us together. In the worst of times, he's never going to leave me, and in his most lonely, vulnerable times, I'm going to kind of put my arms around him and say, I'm here for you, because that's who we are, and that's who we learn to be. I wrote 2 books on this. I wrote a non-clinical book I like pop culture books. I like things that are easy for people to read. And so I wrote a book called Codependence, Beyond the Myth of Codependency, which kind of blows people's minds. And I have to say, I've been speaking on stages like this for 20 years, something like that. And now I've been speaking in front of thousands and all that kind of stuff, and online. I have over 1.5 million downloads of my podcast, and I have lots of people listen to me. But when I do this talk, and I go to a book signing line, people are weeping. I have parents come up to me and say, you're the first therapist who basically didn't imply that I was responsible for my son's death. And my family has gone through our whole relationship thinking that we caused this. You know, what therapist wants to be one who says, I think you should leave them alone and struggle out there until they figure it out, and then they die in the street? Who wants to be the therapist who said, detach with love, that's important. I say more find boundaries, find healthy ways. Now, I'm not saying put up with abuse or violence. I'm not saying that you should put up with circumstances that are intolerable because love keeps us together and all that. You have to have boundaries, and if someone crosses those boundaries, you need to do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. But that's just health. That's just well-being. That's just good self-care. You don't have to teach me that I need to individuate in those circumstances. So this company called Rutledge came to me. I never had to say that right. And they produce all of our, or almost all of our academic journals. And they said to me, you know, we feel like we need another way to look at codependency, that we haven't had one that really, really works, and that we want one for academia. And so I wrote an academic version, which is called The Clinical Alternative to Codependency Treatment. And I'll tell you another reason why this is important to me. What are we teaching our students? Which school of addiction treatment or master's level or whatever is teaching students the same thing about how to handle families? Because it's different no matter what book the teacher read, no matter where they came from. We need a universal form and way of looking at these deeply struggling people whose loved ones are failing. And in my mind, that is strength-based, attachment-based way of looking at them, and we need to move on with love and respect from this model that we've had for 40 years. And with that, I say thank you for your time, and I hope this was helpful, and have a wonderful conference.